in no particular order, I met Mike McIntosh. So Mike McIntosh is the General Manager of Development Services for Port Stephens Council. I was introducing third party Mike to the other two before he arrived. I said, well, Mike's not your garden variety local government bureaucrat. I guess when I met him at Tegan, whose initiative this was, she said, now Mike really runs to a different drum. And in some ways I could talk to you about what he's done and how he's done it differently, but you'll learn more from him directly by the way he answers questions this evening. So Mike, thanks for joining us. Naomi's a lawyer with Spark Helmore and specialises in local government and local planning and government law.
Yep.
All of that, right?
Mining resources as well.
And certainly mining, and interestingly in my view, has practiced both sides of the fence for both development and also for local governments. And then lastly, Mal Coble. Mal's a bit of an enigma. He's just moved into Newcastle and taken up a job 5 weeks ago as General Manager at HunterNet. So you might know HunterNet as the Uni of Newcastle Research Associates, which is a commercial enterprise, but it takes, having now being out there and looked around what they do, there's some wild stuff that goes on out there, and he's got a commercial role out there running that business. Mal, I first met when he was doing a whole bunch of energy-related consulting and advisory work in the private sector, but he's worked public sector extensively, most recently with Transgrid through the sale process in Sydney. And I think that's probably it on you, Mal.
Yeah, I'll do.
Format for this evening. So I guess it was when I was talking to Mike on the phone during the week, he just said, well, what's your definition of public policy? And I said, wow, that's a big question. And look, I took a stab at it, but it's not the definitive. I've just said, what does leadership look like for you folks when it comes to doing business with government? But it relates to the whole regulatory environment and approvals and all that sort of stuff. So if you think about the project's likely to have an impact on some of the stuff that's going on in Newcastle right now. Now, a lot of that is going to have a regulatory framework around it. So in some ways it's that context. And I guess over the years I've heard people say, just even recently, Sydney Metro, government has no bloody clue what it wants. That's right. Why don't you guys get off your date and start thinking about helping them define what might be good for the people of New South Wales, for example. So it's a real issue from a leadership standpoint. So we're going to go through the first 20 minutes will be me asking these folks a couple of questions by way effectively of an interview, but the whole idea is to get them to put a little bit of their skin and thinking on the ground. Then the next 45 or 50 minutes we've got 3 questions, and you're going to stay in those tables and they're going to round table each. So you'll get them sitting at the table. I'd suggest from a dynamic standpoint, sit around them. Don't have them sit up here, immerse them. And so you'll get exposure to each of the 3 for 15 minutes. The format broadly is, here's the question, I reckon that's a crock and here's why. From there, for 5 minutes. And then you guys teasing that out in terms of an interactive Q&A. Why do you think that? What have you seen? How does that stack up right now relative to what's going on in Newcastle, as an example? So you'll get exposure to each of the 3 panellists. And in my view, having sat and participated through hundreds of these things, that's going to be a lot more valuable for you in terms of connecting with these folks, understanding, networking and getting a straight answer. The law of numbers says if you're up in front of 30 people, you'll give a sterilised answer. That makes sense? So that's the plan, and then the last thing we'll do is I wouldn't mind some closing observations from these folks, just about what they heard, didn't hear, and then also just in terms of their walk away, what's the thing that, what is it that may work with this tension between public and private every day, doesn't matter which side, what's the thing that they're continuing to try and work and do better as leaders themselves. So that's the format for the day. So Mal, conversation of the panels, 3 round table topics of 15 minutes. They're not round tables, I get that. Then Q&A, and then at 5:30 the room's going to a whole bunch. I think we've got to reset the room, so we're probably going to ask you to do a little bit of engineering with us, get rid of some tables and layout, because we've got about 50 people later. So what I might do is lift out one definition. Public policy is considered strong when it solves problems efficiently and effectively, serves justice, supports government institutions and policies, and encourages active citizenship. I think one of the panellists walked into their organisation this morning and said, so what do you reckon public policy is? Do you want to share that? What
Yeah.
the answer was?
Yeah, so it was the receptionist. When I came in this morning, I just basically said what I was doing today, and I said I was going to talk about public policy. And she said, well, what's that? And I said, well, what do you think it is? So then the conversation followed. But from her perspective, it was something that was almost unattainable, unreachable. It was something that government decided. It was something that she had no involvement in, and it was out of her control. And I thought, and I said to her, I'm going to use that. I said, because that's brilliant, because that's what most people, I mean, their interface with public policy is probably understanding that it's something over there that happens away from what your day-to-day job is. So, yeah, that's...
So if I were to start with you then, Mel, given that was your receptionist's definition as a layperson,
Yeah.
you know, just lean on your experience, but when you think public policy, what do you think?
I guess you get involved with it without knowing you're involved with it. And when I think public policy, I always seem to go back to the financial things, you know, whether it's tax or super or economic reform, because you think policy, that's what you see on the TV. So that's what you digest, and that's what you kind of, that's just where I always go. And when you look at policy, it's kind of, well, understanding how you measure it. You know, I'm always thinking about, well, what's the impact? But I guess it's much broader than those financial kind of things. When you know, whether it's immigration or whether it's health, you know, it just impacts you every single day. My background, largely in infrastructure and largely electrical, you're kind of governed by policy on what you do on a day-to-day basis, so you get a very strong connection with it. But I guess if you're doing something that's a little bit, you know, more removed from what the policy may be, it's just harder to relate to. So for me, it was, I mean, to be honest, I don't know, does anyone understand the electricity industry?
Do you?
It's a really good question. It's actually really complicated. So it's like in 30 seconds, it's disaggregated. So you've got generation, transmission, distribution, and retail. The roles of each of those particular, you know, I guess individual components are very well defined in national electricity law. So there's things that each of them can and can't do. And that, you know, that sets about giving you a really good guideline. So the AEMC gets involved, and Australian Energy Market Commission, they make up the policy. It gets turned into law. The Australian Energy Regulator enforces the law, they enforce the rules. So, you know, I guess fortunately for me working in the electricity industry, you get a really good handle on it because you kind of have to work with it on a day-to-day basis. So I guess the insight is if you need to think about how you interact with it if you're not directly involved, but I dare say everyone is involved in some way. It's just more obvious sometimes than not with others. So.
The quick grab I take out of you is that public policy is actually societally impacts you personally. Forget business. Every day.
Oh, absolutely.
From a regulatory standpoint, tax, as you said, immigration, and then you sit there and go, well, okay, now I'm taking that hat off, I'm putting on the business hat, leadership hat.
Yep.
And again, it doesn't matter whether you think about your compliance with the Australian Securities Investment Commission, paying tax, the labour laws, and then more germane to what's going on here, the whole urban shift that's going on here. So it's, whether you like it or not, it exists. So then from a leadership standpoint, do you walk around beefing about government and regulation, or do you take the time to engage and understand it and work effectively with it through it? This is kind of the point. Right, I mean, what about a definition from your standpoint?
Just thinking about what's just been said, I guess on a day-to-day basis, because I'm so focused in the legislative framework, often for me it's about what the law is, but you know, we really do have to think behind that as well and say, okay, well, how is this law going to be implemented by this department? How is it going to act? How is it going to operate and interact with other entities? And sometimes the policies for us will be, okay, here's a formal policy for this council, say like a planning agreement policy or something like that, and here's how it's going to be implemented. We know that, we know for certain how that's going to work. But then there's a sort of other airy-fairy sort of general approach of government department that we just have to be aware of. So for example, I think one is the State Environment Protection Authority at the moment has, we see an increased focus on enforcement and prosecution So we are very mindful of that when we're acting for mining companies where there's been an environmental incident, and we're making sure that they've complied with all of the legislative requirements to with a view that the EPA is probably going to take enforcement action. So, those sorts of things we just have to keep in mind. So there's sort of, for us, I guess there's the formal policies and the formal legislation that we always have to look at. But then there's this sort of general approach of government that sits to the side that we have to think about. The Electricity Supply Act is one of my favourite acts. But that's not the be-all and end-all of electricity, of the way the electricity industry works and how it interacts with government as well. So, yeah. So, I'm not sure if that's
it's ambiguous.
what you're looking for.
Yes,
yeah.
Ambiguous.
It is.
But there's a lot of detail, and you either take the arm yourself and engage and understand, or conversely fight.
That's right.
And either way, you probably need a lawyer.
Yeah, I guess from our point of view, we're not paid to have an opinion about whether the public policy is good or bad. Often we are sort of sitting on the fence, and it comes down to us for how to meet the goals of our clients. So if those clients are public authorities, then they might be focused on sending a message or making sure that they're getting things absolutely legally right before they proceed. If we're working for developers, it might be okay. Let's get the bricks and mortar sorted as soon as we possibly can. So so it's a different approach for us. But it's always that policy, whether it be public policy or the goals of the private entity, is what governs our approach to giving advice to clients.
Thank you. Given that you posed the question, Mike, and you and I had about a 4 or 5 minute conversation. You said to me, "What do you mean?" And I told Mike what I thought, and he went, "Right." So ruminate or aerate for a minute or so.
Look, just from backstory, I'm about 18 years of working in a career. First couple of years were I'm a town planner by profession, and started off in a private consultancy, and then moved across into local government, and sort of made my way up through the ranks that way. I only did planning really for a total of about 5 years combined in that time, although I managed a bunch of planners and development services area. Public policy or policy in general bores the hell out of me, and it's interesting that I'm in government. I guess I often ask, why does it exist? And I was just talking to Naomi before about, Naomi asked me the question. I've come up from Melbourne, been up here for about 4 years, and she said, "What's the difference between the planning system down there and up here? And how do you find it up here?" And I said, "I still don't understand how it works."
Either or up here?
No, I know how it works in Victoria more, but that's probably because I started out there, and I've come into the level up here where I'm managing 100 staff that are delivering those services. But fundamentally, the principles are the same, and I focus on that. And I'm sitting there very clear on why does that exist, why do those regulations exist, and whether it's a DCP, LEP or a planning scheme or whatever the title is, it's all the same. They're just guidelines and things that we've obviously as a community said, yes, we believe in government in one way, shape or form. The democratic system is a good system, and so some might see it as a necessary evil to have government, but it's probably better than the alternative that we see elsewhere. So public policy, I probably, you posed the question to me, and I didn't really think I was in the business of public policy. I'm in the business of working in government. Obviously, we're all governed by different policies and things. It's just important to, when you meet with much frustration, and believe me, I'm just as frustrated as anybody when it comes to dealing with bureaucratic organisations. But I'm focused on the end result. And I know that there's all these controls and regulations, and I see a lot of people burn their wheels in that space when they're not focused on the end result. And those that I work with in the private sector on a daily basis, working with local government, those that are effective can see the end result and they understand why it exists, but they don't churn up too much of their energy on the nitty-gritty detail that can be incredibly frustrating to negotiate. So I don't know what public policy is. In the context of this, I'm thinking for me, it's about how do you work better with government? How do you understand how it ticks? And how do you effectively influence? As leaders, it's all about influence. So whether it be colleagues in your organisation or government, you've still got to influence the outcomes that you're after on behalf of the business that you're representing. So if to do that, you need to be acutely aware of why it exists and what it is that local government's set up to do, or state, or whatever agency it is.
Because it can be influenced.
Absolutely it can.
It's a cycle.
Yeah.
So look, rather than couch this thing negatively, the next two things I was going to go on to was ask these folks about public policy failure. But I guess someone in government infrastructure in Sydney mentioned to me recently, they said, look, probably one of the classics was if ever any of you, I know you all cross the Harbour Bridge, I understand that, but if you've been on a rail system that runs out to the airport, it is a classic public policy infrastructure failure. It was set up effectively as a PPP. It ran for a long time. The costs absolutely never created the passenger traffic. There was a government deed supporting it, which in the end the government quietly wrote a cheque for $100 billion, as it did I think $200 million for the Olympic Stadium, and it never makes the papers. And still today, from a patronage standpoint, it's an absolute it's a real catheter. It's not the right word. It's a blockage in the rail network. So there's an executional example. And I thought we could talk about war stories. I'm guessing that each of you would have pile upon pile of war stories. I guess maybe a more optimistic fashion and in tune with the project you guys are going to be working on. In some ways, might behave as better to talk about where you've seen it work well and why. So public policy well executed. Just if you in some ways cast your mind to one that you've seen, I'd be interested in some examples of that, or an example from either each or Wood.
We're just starting at number one.
It's always easy to find the failures. It's hard to find the success stories. Look, at a really, really high level, there's a couple of examples, but the renewable energy target, that's kind of a bit of a success story, and I'll give you a really example of how I've seen it implemented. And there's been a lot in the papers about that over the last sort of 4 or 5 years, and what Malcolm Turnbull did and what Tony Abbott did. But at the end of the day, there's a group of wind farms that exist, that are about to exist between Glen Innes and Inverell. Is anyone aware of those wind farms? Yeah, you had a bit to do with them? Yeah, okay.
The components for those turbines are coming through the Port of Newcastle.
There you go. Yeah, great. So in the absence of the RET, those wind farms weren't going ahead because essentially the proponents or the developers couldn't actually guarantee that there was going to be the requirement there. Like they couldn't get power purchase agreements to secure the revenue they needed. So and it was like the lights, overnight were switched on, because as soon as that policy became a little bit more certain and it was ratified, there was a whole bunch of activity. So, and I was at Transgrid at the time, so you could see, there'd be 2 or 3 inquiries a week from large-scale developers, not just wind but solar as well, and that was almost non-existent for the 12 months before. So that's just a real, it was polar in terms of the response. Now those wind farms, to give you an idea of the size, if people don't know about them, there's about 700 megawatts of wind, so it's like half a power station up the Hunter.
In how many turbines?
Look, they vary in size, but about 4 megawatts a turbine, so there's a few hundred of them. I had a video, I didn't think to bring it, but it's actually, the scale of it's incredible, like they're just spread over the countryside. But if you've been up to that country, it's actually probably really good use of the land, because it's, it's pretty sparse. It's not really good prime agricultural country. But yeah, that's a good example of policy at work to do the right things. There's a long way to go when you look at and I don't know what your passions are around renewable energy, but there's obviously an impact. The downside of that is actually what's happening in the Hunter with the coal industry and all the pressure that industry has on it. So for various reasons, the future is going to be a mix of all of those technologies. So that's policy, there's an upside of that. Obviously the government's still got other policies that relate to, what can we do for clean coal, and even some of the projects at the university now are looking at mineral carbonation, so capturing, CO2 and making good use out of it. So there's those kind of things are, they are driven by policy. So yeah, there's a. Are we going to cover the war stories later? Because I got a good one of those.
Do a glass of wine on you. It'll be. Or we'll make my client have one.
I was just wondering if we do that after his video on YouTube.
Yeah. Well, I'm about to totally contradict that because, from a successful failures, a perspective thing. So I had on my list the New South Wales gas plan, which was basically the plan to pause and reset coal seam gas exploration and mining in New South Wales. So the state government's gone through a process of buying back all the petroleum exploration licences, and that's been quite successful from the government point of view, and from a sort of farming, if you're a farmer or if you're if you're an environmental conservationist, then obviously that's been quite a successful story. But from the development industry and the mining industry and the gas industry point of view, it's a loss of an opportunity for New South Wales. There's a lot more coal seam gas mining and exploration going on in Queensland, and that just means less economic development in New South Wales and the Hunter region. So I guess that's sort of success slash failure, depending on which side of the fence you sit on. In terms of, I think we're focusing on urban renewal, are we? So in terms of urban renewal, I've seen quite a few urban renewal projects that have been really successful. We're getting there. I think in Newcastle, the decisions about the rail, about mine subsidence, grouting, and contributions from the mine subsidence fund towards grouting, the university moving into the city, all of those things have sort of come together to provide the incentive, I think, for urban renewal and urban development in Newcastle. So that's a really positive impact, and we see that as a business in Newcastle, and as well as for our clients. A lot of our clients are developers, so we've been involved in quite a few multi-storey developments in Newcastle since all of those things have happened, which has been great. And from my perspective, just things that I'm working on at the moment. I'm working on for a few Sydney City councils that basically, or Sydney Metropolitan Councils that basically are providing policies where developers can get bonus development rights, and in exchange, provided for providing public benefits like improving the public domain areas or improving footpaths, roads, public parks, those sorts of things. And that's a really positive, I find that really positive work for me, because I'm doing work that results in good environmental outcomes for everybody, public benefits for the council, and it's the council and the developers working together so that they can all get a benefit out of that process. So that's really my sort of current, I guess, success story at the moment.
You three may not know this, but 4 weeks ago, these folks went through Barangaroo.
Right, okay,
And
yes,
an
yes.
interesting fact, I think it came out at the time that the original DA was for 300,000 square metres of office space. The final built form, commercial office space, was only 600,000. Good or bad, great demonstration of, as I say, right or wrong, whether you agree with or not, of persuasion, of influence, of that envelope. And I don't know how much you understand about the value that they created, but just use a simple metric and say it was double. Right? And then you walk around that building space that we walked around, and as I say, make your own personal assessment of it. But in many ways, that's a very apt example of public policy at play.
Okay, yeah, and it's about encouraging that development and the developers also being open to sharing the value of that increased development right as well.
Mike, what about you?
Just a couple of thoughts. I think if you have the approach in government to, whilst there's regulations and things, really the mantra should be trying to get out of the way of private sector to do what it has to do. Everyone understands there needs to be controls and things in place, but if government can get out of the way and just let that market operate, almost like I think I might have been talking to you, Ed, about it with respect to microeconomic theory, and you're talking about the market and not wanting to impact on the market, and as soon as you do introduce taxes and things, it sort of affects that market. And it's the same sort of thing with government. As soon as you start, it depends. It's a fine line between tinkering around. We know that we need to make sure that everybody has access to social needs and all those sorts of things. But you can't go too heavy on it, otherwise it impacts on the market and perfect competition. So I look at when I then look at examples. A good example, and probably one I wasn't familiar with. If you are doing urban renewal, looking at postcode 3000, which occurred down in Melbourne back in, well, it was before I started, so I'll say around about, so let's say the early 90s, where it was an initiative to generate activity back into the CBD of Melbourne. And Melbourne was a fairly dead place after 5 o'clock on any night, and certainly on the weekends pretty dead. And postcode 3000 was an initiative to get people living back into the CBD and activating the place, and did so by getting out of the way of entrepreneurial effort and capital investment, and freeing up some of the planning controls that existed. But little things like allowing liquor licences to, basically giving out liquor licences to areas that were, a third or a quarter of the size of this room here. So you start to get all these little bars and things opening up, and so you don't have the massive big pubs that can create quite an issue and a problem. I mean, obviously they still exist, but they're in competition then with these funkier little wine bars and boutique, breweries and the like. So people would hang around longer, and that coupled with, cafes started to pop up, and a cafe could be in space this big, and you would see that obviously in Sydney, they're obviously new as well. But that sort of thing had never been seen before in Melbourne, and it just started to get people back to the urban area, and therefore commerce flowed from there. So that was getting out of the way of entrepreneurial effort to stimulate the economy that way, and then things flourish from there. So I'd say that's a real success. Obviously, Marcus Westbury and his merry men are trying to do the same thing here in Newcastle. Marcus, I've had a bit to do with Marcus back down in Melbourne, and but he's trying to do the same thing, trying to sort of free up some of the lease arrangements and licence arrangements, so you can get some of those pop-up shops going, and therefore there's not as much risk on somebody looking to start a small business, just to have a crack. So it's those sort of little things that you can do. It doesn't have to be big things, and just to activate space and get people in them. As soon as you do that, everything seems to flow. So that's a real success story, and I'd encourage you to have a look at that. Postcode 3000 is what it's called.
And that was a government initiative.
Yeah.
Melbourne City
Council. Melbourne. Yeah.
Yep. Quick questions or comments, guys, because we're about to sort of wrap that part of it and move on. Are there any sort of other quick questions or observations that occur from anything that these folks have said?
It's just a kind of a question on your comments around, we need to let kind of the private sector get on with what they need to do. How do you balance that with, I guess, the government's social objectives?
Yeah. Well, there's different ways that you can interpret what the rules are and what the policy is, and I find, you know, in my capacity, in my job, I'm forever communicating the context to staff about why it exists and what their role is in it, and pulling them back from, you know, yes, no, tick box type arrangements. I was saying to these guys before, I had the conversation with the planners, for example, of some years ago, where I said, look, if we just wanted people to tick boxes, you know, you'd employ monkeys. Anyone can do that. You've got a degree. You've spent 4 years at university and whatever else you're doing. Use that initiative. That's what we're paying you for. And you can't. For me, it's about creating an environment where they can take risks and use their own judgment. I think it's typically a risk-averse environment because you're not rewarded for risk, whereas you guys are rewarded for risk in some, you know, obviously calculated, but there is no benefit to somebody putting their neck on the line. So you've got to understand that as well when working with them. Why don't they? You know, they're so stuck in the mud and all this sort of thing. But so we look for other ways to reward in that sense and get them to continue to take more risk. So we constantly seek feedback from the industry that we work with, the industry bodies that we work with. How are we going? And you know, when you get feedback that suggests, oh, you guys are fantastic, you're really easy to deal with, that impact on staff is massive, and then they start to sort of feel a bit, they walk a bit taller, and they use their initiative a little bit more. But as leaders in government, I see it as my role to continue to sort of foster that initiative and to support them and empower them just to get on with it and look at the high level objectives of the policy as opposed to the nitty gritty detail of it. We obviously need that from time to time, but look at the high level. And also I try and bring people back to why it is you're there in the first place. For me, it's about creating great communities. That's my driver. And I just find myself in this space at the moment, and I'm sure I'll be in another space somewhere down the track. And so, as planners in that instance, don't lose that. Don't lose that why you signed up to be an urban planner in the beginning and why you ended up here. And so it's constant storytelling, contextualising is probably how we work on it.
Is there a double-edged sword though with public policy where you say we've got these parameters and we've got these achievements that we want to get by putting in the public policy, so it has to be prescriptive enough that it's going to achieve those outcomes, but then it also has to be, I don't want to use the word vague, but open to interpretation enough.
High level
that
enough.
Flexible.
Flexible.
There we go. Flexible enough that you don't end up with cookie cutter answers where every approach to utilising that policy is exactly the same.
So I've got a really good example for you. And I'll keep talking about the electricity industry, I know, but I'm sorry.
It's all you know, mate. You realise how much you don't know.
But it's also it's a Sydney example. But the Sydney CBD is going to have a supply shortage in a few years' time. And it's not because the load's growing that much, it's because that Ausgrid's retiring cables in their network and there's going to be a shortage because the old cables, you know, are taken out of the equation. So a Transgrid and my involvement in that project was a project called Powering Sydney's Future, and Transgrid is looking at building a 330 kV cable into the city. Now, it's really impressive, there's a few numbers. There's about $500 million to build that new cable into the city. So there's an incentive there, and it's in the rules for networks that we need to look at all alternatives before we build something, you know, being a network head-on. So anything else you could do to defer that investment is going to save money for all of us because we all pay our electricity bills, right? We all pay for it indirectly. So in the electricity rules, there's other ways that you can go about this, and one of the things is demand response. So rather than, you know, and it's really simple, basically give people a signal to turn the lights off or, you know, reduce power at a certain time, so therefore you don't have to meet that peak. Now there's a really good case for doing that in the Sydney CBD. The policy implication there, what the rules say around what companies can do, meant that Transgrid could only do so much. Now, it goes a little bit further. They've actually got this thing, for the revenue reset, they've got this thing called a consumer challenge panel. So basically, if there's a requirement for additional funds for a monopoly business to actually, they need to engage with the community to actually get that approved. and we're only talking about a small amount of money, but there was an idea put forward to this consumer challenge panel that Transgrid should invest in doing demand response rather than spend $500 million. And the consumer challenge panel said, the law says this, basically you want another $10 million over 5 years, it's too much money, you can't have it, just that's it, flat no. At the same time, the demand, Ausgrid changed the demand forecast, so the demand went away. So the problem's still there, but it's a few years out. The reality is, because there's no investment made in looking at demand response, when the load comes, well, when the issue comes around, there's no alternative but to go and spend $500 million on infrastructure. And I think there was other ways of going around it. So that's, to your point around policy, a failure if you look at the hard letter. And that's people not thinking about what the intent of the policy is. They're just looking, and there's a lot of people involved in it, but if you don't look at what the intent is and just take it like the black and white letter, then it's a big failure and everyone pays for it.
I'll tell you what I might do. Because we've got a Q&A session at the back end. Are you relaxed about it? I probably shouldn't open the can because we'll be here forever. Can we cut, if you're okay, to the next piece, which we'll do, give you guys the opportunity to ask the same questions, but one of three, if that's okay. So what we're going to do is, I didn't really ask if that was okay. So the whole idea is, and I'll be really rigid with you on time, so you know exactly when you're going to wrap up. But it's 3 sweeps of 15 minutes. So the table leaders pose and address one of these 3 questions, which is in the second. But the first thing they do, I've already run them briefly, when they sit down, just name the company, first name, you guys. What the first thing we want them to do is meet you. So I want them to meet each of the 3, so that's hence the table rotation. So quick introduction. Panellists' opinion.
Because, often people in government, whether it be a monopoly or whether it just be government generally, are bound by rules and regulations on the things they must do, which slows the whole process down.
And I guess the private sector may not be fully aware of those rules, or those constraints on the public side.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
So it's like, we're trying to do the good thing here. We want to build, you're holding us up. But the reason is, the public side is restrained by these legal, or their interpretation of the legal framework.
Yep.
Yeah, it's probably not very well communicated between sides.
Yeah.
That probably then comes back to the leadership on both sides as well, and how much they're caught up with making sure they tick all the boxes and dot the I's and cross the T's, versus how much they want to work together and have a positive outcome for both parties.
And I know Ed talked a bit about networking. I don't know what you cover in your course, but it's really important, because when you do start to come up with obstacles, often it depends on the network of your most senior leaders on solving those problems. And I've seen it in action, and it's really pretty to watch. But you just need those connections in the first place. So don't underestimate that. I think it's really important. And the longer you work in one particular industry, you obviously get to understand how to work around it.
Public and private working together, you'd probably see it most commonly through like a tender review process.
Yeah.
Trying to understand each other's goals and addressing those.
Although you find a lot of those processes are so, there's a need for them to be so arm's length that you don't often get that level of negotiation and awareness in that process. Particularly on the government side. Like, I've done tenders for government, as in submitting, and you just can't have a conversation with people because they go into lockdown because they don't want to discuss anything, and when they do, and everyone starts to play that competitive game because there's a lot of money at stake.
Any biases or favouritism.
And you've got to be careful what questions you ask, because if you ask one question, then everyone gets to see the same question. So know what you're thinking. So it becomes a little bit more strategic. It's hard. Yeah. So often, and in particularly in that case with tenders, the relationships you have before are really important. But it can work. And I don't think. The government can't solve all the problems it's got to solve today in isolation. Just can't do it. So it needs private sector. A lot of it, and I don't know if there's any economic theorists here, but a lot of it depends on having a market present to solve some of the problems. And that's where government and policy is important, because they need to actually help create that market. No different to the demand response, demand management example. There isn't a market there. So in that example, because there's nothing in place. If the government doesn't do anything, nothing's going to happen. No private sector is going to jump up and say, I'm going to spend all my money to solve a problem that may or may not be the right solution. It just doesn't happen, right? So if the market exists and the same incentives are there, then you need that common goal as well.
Do you see an increase in the public-private partnerships occurring, or have you seen over the last 5 years with change of different governments that are currently in, or are certain governments more sort of open to?
It's probably an area that I'm not close to. Coming from a regulated monopoly-based networks, whether it be transmission or distribution, are kind of fairly fixed, and those relationships aren't necessarily there. It probably is the case. Ed's the one to talk to. He might have some great insights because he works with a lot of the big construction companies. So I think it's more in that space where you see it happening. Roads is a classic. There's a lot of that stuff going on in roads, but I'm just not close to it, so I can't give you any really good insights. Yeah. I don't know if there's anything else I can add. More questions?
Have you seen cases where there has been a complete breakdown of the relationship between the two parties? And how was it resolved, if it was resolved? I guess that comes out of the premise of that question.
I've seen some failures in some fairly major contracts, and it ends up in litigation.
Yeah.
And that's not pretty. So everyone's a loser. Yeah. So there was a big one. I went over to New Zealand when I was working for Evans & Peck to provide expert insight into a case between a construction company. They were building a DC link between the islands, and that wasn't pretty. Yeah, and then I guess, I haven't seen any really good examples of a bad outcome. I haven't seen it just costs money and time and aggravation. And someone else is left holding the can. Often the government. Whoever's got the deepest pockets is generally the person that's left standing.
They become the bank.
Yep.
To bail it out.
Yeah.
They become publicly unpopular.
Same as what Ed said before around the
Stadium
and the link, airport link. Yeah.
So what about examples of really good collaboration between private and? There's one example I had when working with UGL Rail, and they had a big contract with State Rail back then to provide rolling stock. And actually, they won an award for project management because between the two parties, they'd worked out an incentive system where they both worked together and achieved things on time. They both shared the financial benefit from it. It was a 50-50 sort of split.
Yeah, the pain gain share stuff. It's becoming very popular. And in fact, and I'm not close to this one either, telling tales out of school, but the sale of Transcript, they just sold Transcript when I was still there in December last year. They got $10.25 billion for it. So there's a lot of money at stake. Word has it that those people that were involved in doing the advisory services for the successful bidder, the retainer was subject to them delivering the efficiency outcomes. So you had a lot of consultants that hung around after the sale went through to complete the work to enable whatever they set up front, so they weren't going to get paid if they didn't actually achieve those outcomes. It's really smart. There's probably an element, I don't know how much truth there is in it. I think there must be an element of truth, but I don't know, between what the extremes were. But that's
that's
good.
The kind of thing that you'd see being set up, while it's being tendered, that those sort of discussions have. I don't know how it worked with the UGL one and State Rail. It was something that discussed with the tenderers.
I think the more forward-thinking tenderers are doing that. I've not been involved in one directly, so I don't. It's anecdotal, but those things are happening. Certainly in professional services, when you get into the consulting, professional services, there's a tendency to link it more closely to what outcome you're trying to deliver, and it's often easier to do because it's harder to define. So when you've got real fixed outcomes, then that's probably not as necessary, perhaps. I don't know. The minister on television, he's always talking about all the tunnelling projects for WestConnex, on time, on budget. It's a partnership. It's a good arrangement. So if you believe the media, then that's actually working well. I don't know how you actually get under the covers to find out. Yeah, you have to be involved in it, I suppose. I don't know.
Thanks, Matt.
That's right. Yeah. It's just an opinion too, right?
In your role now, got a day-to-day interaction with policy and public.
So, given my background, so Tunra itself, it used to be called Newcastle Innovation, and then some of it was split out and went back into the university, and the commercial industry linking side stays, as a separate entity. So I've got a separate board. I report into the board, which is a subsidiary of the university, right? So they're looking at other businesses. So one of the other businesses is obviously looking at new energy integration, what you do, which is where I come from. So last Friday I went down and met with the Department of Industry and talked to them about, well, what can we do to help? Now the university is not a commercial entity, but we're not there to lose money either. So it's about how do we work with government on that project to actually, what can we do to help facilitate, a stream under the Energy and Resources Knowledge Hub on energy as opposed to just resources. So are you guys aware of the Energy and Resources Knowledge Hub? You seen that? Oh, jeez, I should have done some more sales and marketing. So, there's things that you can do. It's just actually through the contacts you have. You establish them, and particularly in this case, government's driving a lot of the, they're about to deliver an energy strategy. I haven't seen it. Alan Broadfoot, who is the director of NEAR, is going to go down and meet with them in about 2 weeks on a working group. So you can help inform them and influence it.
Yep.
And you do get involved. That's a real life example.
So when you say, when you say university commercial entity, so what's the key drivers for the university? What's the university's targets and goals out of being...
Research. So if you can actually...
But if it's not to commercialise that research...
Oh, no, there is a separate... commercialise it, but the way they do it is different. Like, we're not there to grow a business of 500 people doing, some other commercial task. It's around promoting investment in research, and those research outcomes can get invested and generally fund more research, right? So it's all about, research and innovation and the kind of stuff we do.
Put your hands together and thank your panellists.
So I had a good think about this question because I really thought to myself, are there fundamental differences between public sector and private sector? And I guess, in terms of management, there's not really, I don't think that there's a lot of difference between the way it's changed a lot. I think government departments are moving more towards a business approach to working, I think I think really it's about those goals. So I think Rebecca, you mentioned that social goal that most government departments or public authorities or quasi-governments, if you want to call state-owned corporations, they will have certain policies that relate to the community and social issues and how they interact with the public. So I think there is that difference in goals from my perspective. I will often rethink advices depending on what the goal of my client will be. Obviously, I will give them the legal advice, but when it comes to the practical outcomes of that advice, I might say, okay, well, your real goal is to make sure that your public relations and the way that your corporation is expressed, in the media or presented in the media, that's really important to you. So I think you should take this strategy rather than take perhaps a purely litigation strategy where that might give you the best economic outcome. So it really depends. I think there is a difference in goals, but I don't necessarily think that it's always impossible for them to work, together. So I think, you will have heard the planning agreement example is my example at the moment of what I'm working on mostly. And that's, really trying to meet the goals of both the council and the developer at the same time. So, and it can be done. Anybody have any experiences with where it's been totally impossible to work with? We've got some. Well, you're not government, really.
No, so I've done.
So you've done both,
the same business,
yes.
And that business was a state government agency, and now it is a private sector
Yeah.
company doing exactly the same thing.
Same thing. So, and is it run the same way? Are there big differences? Same objectives, or?
So we do have we have less mandated social goals. So we have no mandated social goals. So when we were a government agency, there was a requirement to have, you know, to satisfy the minister and the government, and that we were acting in a way that was in the public interest. Okay, so that was like a legislative, really important to be. You know, we were on the phone to the minister.
What's your overarching policy, basically, of everything you do has to meet that public interest
And now, as a
goal?
private company, that's not a legal requirement. But I guess what my question would be is there, and you would probably saw it with talking to Len Mason in Barangaroo. There are private companies. This is kind of a trend towards adopting quasi social interest, community interest goals as part of your kind of corporate social responsibility.
Yes, yeah.
And is that a growing trend? Is that a good thing? Is it real? Like, is it just PR?
It's very real. I can just chip in there.
Oh,
Like,
yes,
start
yeah.
bank,
Well,
like
bank,
reputation
yeah,
damage is
yeah.
something that we rate in every deal. Every sizable deal we work on, if it's like, well, if we go lend money to entity X and they fall over, and then we're the big bad bank repossessing that asset, we're going to be on a current affair. Like, you know,
that's right.
Is that the case?
Yeah.
So
That's because it's a quantifiable commercial.
that's just a really simple example. That's what, correct. So that's where this price signals back,
has a
because
consequence.
it hurts the share price and it hurts the reputation of the business, and the business is to be Australia's most respected bank, right? So, because there's a recognition at a genuine level that we're a stakeholder in the Australian community, and there's a recognition also from a dollars and cents perspective. If you become known as the Prince of Darkness, it'll hurt your share price.
Yeah.
Right? So, depending on which camp do you want to be in.
And that's actually really more important for listed companies as well, rather than say, you know, maybe a smaller developer or someone like that who,
So that means that you can actually have quite like goals and quite or mutually shared goals. The motivation is
But the motivation is different. Yes, yeah.
and that may or may not be.
Yeah.
Leverage them. So as the developers that we deal with will find the policies that the public sector will be looking to enforce and get on board with those, leverage that to get their planning approval or whatever they might donate some money to a park nearby.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, so for those public benefits, they're benefits that are also going to benefit the development. So if you've got a park right out the front door of your development, then the value of your units is going to go up. So, so it becomes an economic motivation, but it's still the same goal. Yeah.
It's how you sell it as well. It's how you sell it to council.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And and how council sells it to the developer sometimes as well. So the council can say, look, we really want this park. And the developer's going, that's going to cost me a lot of money. I'm going to have to dedicate some land to you, and I'm going to have to do this and do that. But then, the council says, well, how about, the value of your property is going to go up because it's going to be a nicer place to live. So. Anybody else got any? So do we say there are fundamental differences, perhaps in motivation, but not always, and not always in the ultimate goal. So it means that they can work together.
And I think some of the biggest projects that New South Wales has delivered has had to be a combination of private and public. I don't know about you, John, but because we work on really big infrastructure projects
PPPs,
as well. And we provide the manpower that private just doesn't have, and the experience on multiple projects and stuff. And so I think both parties have something to, if it can be leveraged properly. So it's also about whoever the leader is and making sure that the leader can harness these motivations, and then the way that people do work to get a single combined and shared goal. Because as a consultant, I recognise that we probably do most of the work, and the client, our private people, they do a lot of the thinking and the direction around it.
Yeah, so it's about finding the right role for each party in the process, depending on, and leveraging their interests, their goals, and their resources. So, yep.
No, we sort of spoke about it earlier. Like, public sector seems to have a lot of stakeholders and interests, whereas the private may not be aligned with those interests. So it's sort of finding a way to negotiate.
But they may not also be distracted by that.
Yeah,
you
true.
know,
Yeah,
often,
you know, if someone's knocking on your door and complaining.
yeah, so then you can just go and do your job and do whatever you've been asked to do in that little box well. So that whoever your client is can go away and talk to the little old lady and not be, you know.
Yeah. Do you think there's more public scrutiny of public authorities, government departments, public? So, you know, I know Oliver was just saying, well, you know, we do have to, you know, I guess for NAB, they're, you know, a big, well-known corporation, but in most places there will be more public scrutiny, I would think, of the public entity in those relationships than the private entity. No, Pacific National, yeah. So you would have, I don't often see negative reports about Pacific National in the newspaper, in the local newspaper.
Only when the Arab goes and jumps on their covered coal wagon.
Yeah, but that's not a negative, I suppose.
It's still a negative.
It's still a
because
negative.
Because it drives the government's response. So
it does,
We get the EPA jumping in with both feet because the minister doesn't want it to be in the news and they can't seem to be bad.
Yes.
Even though the whole basis of the Herald's articles were based off US data that is totally irrelevant to the Australian market. And so it turns into a political nightmare that has no practical benefits for anybody in the industry.
And the EPA has to be seen to be, or the government seen to be doing something, which is what I was saying earlier. There's sort of this increased approach to, you know, enforcement because I think mainly after Orica. You know, so there's a government, so they really have to be seen to be doing things, and whether it's things that are legitimate, have a legitimate scientific basis or not is another question. So,
my role is I deal with effectively 3 different government-owned corporations. 2 are state government-owned and 1 international. And the behaviour and different outlook of those 3 is very different. So we've got ARTC as a national body, federal government-owned, federal government supervised. Seems to be, well, for us it's a lot easier to deal with. They seem a lot more focused on trademark than they do with, you know, whenever we start dealing with both the Queensland and New South Wales government-owned, they're pretty nightmare.
yeah.
I would agree. I just thought it was because the feds were paid in one place.
Do you think it's resources? Do you think it's resources?
No.
The public servants.
The state government corporations have got more resources than the federal government.
Right.
So it's not a question of resourcing.
So it's just.
The example I gave earlier. We will go into a meeting to discuss a technical issue with Transport for New South Wales. We'll have 2 engineers on our side of the table who will be facing at least 30%.
Yeah.
When I go to ARTC, I will have 2 on the other side of the table.
Yeah.
Not because there's 50 in the back office, because there's 2 of them and they only need 2 of them to deal with it.
So do you think it's cultural, or do you think that comes from? Like more policy approach? You must get it right. You must make sure. You know, what happens if something goes wrong? Who's responsible for it?
Interrogation.
Well, I haven't had one with this many on the panel.
I spent 5 years at Fox Stevens Council.
Did you? How long ago?
2003 onwards, whatever that is.
Yeah, whatever. Very different place then than it is now, I think. But all right. So the question we've got here is to discuss the fundamental differences between public and private sector make it impossible to work together towards a common goal. Discuss.
Aren't you supposed to tell us your opinion?
I'm throwing it out. There are a bunch of leaders with opinions.
I don't necessarily agree with that. I think there's a lot of value in pre-DA meetings and those sorts of things to try and knuckle out a development proposal before it gets too far down the track.
Yep.
I think that's an important process, and I think that's something that councils offer that's really good. So yeah, I don't agree with that.
What about?
I don't think you need to be working towards the same goal to achieve something in the middle.
Yep.
like maybe that's not even a tangible.
You never can have the
Tangible,
same
but like a-
desires, but you can get it.
So
Yeah, you can both work towards different goals to have a good outcome, or whatever that is.
Yep.
I think both parties have a certain level of experience that can help each other. So say you're a mine and you have an environmental compliance issue, like you know your site really well, and the compliance officers know a lot of sites really well. So like having both of that information together, like you can get a better outcome because they've seen lots of other ways it's worked better. So you can get that information and can pass up to them.
They don't always share it though. They don't always share it. Some situations they're not encouraged to share it, which is incredibly frustrating.
Yeah. I think there's benefit. I suppose that's the question: is that
Yeah, how to get them sharing.
Yeah.
What about we look at what are the fundamental differences between public and private?
Focus.
Yeah.
So
What's that mean?
in terms of if you're coming out of, and you're a business, so you're private sector, and realistically you're about maintaining your business and existing as a business. So therefore, is there an inherent amount of, if you want to make money, you need to make enough money that your company still survives.
Yep.
As opposed to some of the public sector or the government who's looking sort of overarchingly saying, no, it's not about making money for us because that's not necessarily our main goal. It's
Yep.
about contributing to the community and
Sure.
providing services. And so there's a different end game, I guess, in terms of what each person is,
Yeah.
or each side's trying to achieve.
neither can exist without the other.
Sure, there's the crossover.
Depends who you work for as to whether they.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Anybody else? Fundamental differences?
I'm not sure that is that fundamental because many private sector organisations in the longer term actually need to have community support, which then reflects what the public sector is working towards.
Sure.
So there's different scenarios. I don't think it's always a fundamental difference.
Yeah, I think that's an important conversation to have in your organisation as well. I mean, you're right. Obviously, you can't survive if you're not making $1. It's pretty simple, and it's a massive motivator and driver, and the whole economy's based on it. But what is the purpose? What was the primary purpose? You're an architect. Why did you become an architect?
To design buildings.
That's right.
Yeah.
You didn't sit there and go, I'm going to be an architect to make money.
No, because architects don't make money.
That's right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But what is it about designing buildings that you like?
That I like. It's
Yeah.
the sense of achievement and what you're contributing
Yep.
by creating something that's tangible and
Yep.
you can walk inside
And the aesthetic of it and all that sort of stuff. And design would no doubt be something that you would have a view on and be passionate about.
Yes.
And so then you've got the public sector, who's arguably trying to create a character and neighbourhood and all those sorts of things that is pleasing to the masses and all that sort of stuff. Now, we're not going to get into the business of architects and planners and things like that, but it's about finding that why. Why does it exist? Why does this joint exist? Was it just fundamentally to make money? I'm tipping the fellas women or men, whoever who got together, I don't know how the joint works, probably a number of partnerships and things like that. But at the end of the day, it was probably meeting a need that was something that was probably community based. Somebody needed some help. I can help you. You give me some money, I can help you. But it's having that dialogue in your organisation, understanding. Yes, it is dollars, but it's really important that as leaders we contextualise that to keep people. I reckon it's important from just a person in a community. It's important that we remember why it's there. Sure, you'll get some hard-ass bastards that just don't give a shit and they'll just want to make as much money as possible. That's good, but I kind of don't get the sense of that's why everyone in this room is here.
Yeah.
Sorry?
Except for the banker in the corner.
So the question again, the fundamental differences between public and private sector make it impossible to work together towards a common goal. Discuss. The other thing I want to talk about is probably that common goal. It's so important. when you're dealing with the public sector, what do you think is the lens or the framework? Are you looking at that common goal necessarily?
No. You look at your own goal, and there's the big goal in the middle. That's what I think.
Yep. Yeah, no. Fair enough.
Not just no. That's what I think.
Yep. What about you?
I think it depends where you sit in the organisation, because I think we do, because quite often, just because we're environment team, we work for, a rail asset manager.
Yeah.
So we really are looking at our impacts on the community.
Sure.
So I think we're probably positioned somewhat uniquely though.
Yep. Yep.
Which makes it a really fun but challenging job.
Yeah, of course.
I think there's differences with scales of development too. I think on the smaller scale, it's sometimes much easier or sometimes much harder. Like so, if you're doing a single residence, for example, you might have completely deemed it comply straight over the counter, done it fast and easy. Or you could want this beautiful architectural house, which all of a sudden council, well, that doesn't fit the nature of the street. Everyone else has got bigger fences and cottages. It doesn't work. So I think sometimes there's complete opposites of the spectrum. I think reaching the common goal part of things, the most important part is on the larger scale stuff. Your new subdivisions, your town centre developments, that sort of stuff. I think that's when that reaching the common goal is.
Sure. Yep. Yeah, good.
There was a planning old sort of thing they were floating around. I think Queensland it was called place-based development. I don't know if you know about that, but it was where it wasn't so prescriptive on DCPs and LEPs. It was a like here's the box.
Yeah.
And allowed the private sector to work within that. Well, it did fail, by the way, but it was quite an interesting way of trying to allow the private sector to have more scope.
Isn't there an inherent issue in terms of, in the end, one person has more power necessarily, maybe possibly, than the other?
Yeah,
so you sit there and you go, ultimately, you still have someone who's in a position where they say, okay, yeah, I agree with you.
Sure.
Not. You know, there's still two sides to the table. There's still, okay, this is what you've said and this is my interpretation. Can I now convince you to agree with me?
Yeah.
You're still the one making the decision. You're still saying, there's still someone at some level who goes, yes, I agree with you. Yeah, or no, I don't.
You go to court. Whatever.
But then even when you go to court, there's still someone who's making a decision.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? There's always still a position or a role in that situation where someone needs to agree with you.
That's true.
Or to agree to disagree with you, and then that's it.
Yeah, but you can change the balance by where you take the decision making to a certain extent.
So how, as leaders, can we make it more possible to work together for a common goal between public and private?
Be honest, and I think we were talking earlier about you've got to have the ability to identify what the common goal is and what the greater good is of what you're attempting to do from all sides. Inherently, do we all agree with the fact that this is the overarching main goal? Yes, okay. Everything else then should fall in line with that as the goal, whether it's to your benefit, to your decision,
Yep.
That's ideal world though.
Backwards about the communication, because I suppose at the end of the day, everyone's got a common goal. It's about understanding what's your common goal.
Yeah. So as a leader, what do you do?
We're all guilty of being our own silos and the business has got the same goals. You go into an operation says, let's collaborative effort, just keep checking, but understanding what makes sense. So we need to check this out.
So you make time to meet the right people who might have some commonality. Because you're right, your priority list, even if you've got some common goals, it's never going to be the same priority list as theirs.
Sure.
But it's also working with them to identify maybe what I've come across is a group or a person might have a goal that they think is their ultimate goal, but when you kind of work with them to peel that back a little bit more, it's actually not quite that goal, it's something else, and you've developed that goal together. So that's why you need to understand what their goal is and maybe sort of workshop that a little bit, as well as put your own into it as well. have a planned approach to it as well. You can understand that process before you go into meetings.
Yeah.
I think coming from the other side of the fence, working in government, listening to everything that you said, and I work in planning and development, is understanding the challenges that we have on the other side. Like, it's not fun to say you can't do that, but I've got no control over that. I've got a document that I have to follow. So it's understanding both sides have that challenge, and what can you do to work together to deal with those challenges.
And how, you know, at the end of the day, how often you get a phone call after a job's gone through and say, oh, geez, thanks for that great job. It's never how you do
right.
it.
But when you get, a DA submitted that doesn't have all the information, all you're getting is resistance from all the others from the other side. Like, I can't process that because you haven't given me what.
At least being the consultant, you get it through there, and the client goes, oh, thanks for all the hard work you got that through. But,
You know, often it comes down to how well you trust and the strength of your relationships with people. Now, if you're two friends at a pub, you'll make a decision and you'll both walk away pretty happy. But because we don't quite know each other, you know, it's a bit of, well, I'll get this and you get that. As leaders, the responsibility you have as leaders in this community is to, in my mind, try and create the conditions as much as possible, like your best. You're in a pub, in a sense. It's basic human interaction. Go the extra yard, get to know people that you don't necessarily know. Invest in that, because you're ultimately going to be responsible for what this joint looks like in 20 years' time. So you can sit back and watch it go past and take pot shots at people that make stupid decisions, or you can get in there and be that change and take that responsibility. And not everyone is prepared to take that responsibility. I encourage you to get involved and know that you're good enough to take that responsibility and influence it and be that person. I think that's really important. And then, so it's you know the people that you would deal with that you know really well. It's an easy transaction.
Put your hands together and wrap up. Thanks, guys. Folks, we're pretty much close on. I'd just like you to finish by giving these folks their 30 seconds. What did you see in here, Mike?
Geez.
It's like a test.
Probably the key take home. I was always thinking about this public-private thing in the context of leadership and the context of all of you in the room here, and indeed all of us here are leaders in our professions in some way, shape or form, and being aware of the responsibility that comes with that, and being that change, taking that responsibility and being that change for the community that you work in, not just in the profession that you're in, but for the broader community. So get involved in conversations and things like that you might not, might not be going to earn you $1, but it's good for the community, and that's what leadership's about, to get involved in a whole range of different conversations and help shape the community that you really want to see it look like. So that'd be my message.
Awesome. Thanks, Naomi.
Yeah, and just, I guess, going on from there, transparency from my point of view is a big thing on both sides, and being open about the goals and the direction, whether it's motivated. I think we had a discussion over here about whether it's motivated by economics or motivated by public scrutiny, public interest. That common goal is the thing that we need to aim for, and being involved, understanding the bigger picture, understanding the context of everything that you do, and responding to those things like requests for input into legislative frameworks, those sorts of things. Being involved in that process as leaders is really important. How those changes will affect you and your business. I think the government needs to hear that, because public policy can't change without everybody's input, without knowing where it needs to head.
Thank you. Mel.
I'll go back to where I started with what our receptionist was saying to me about how difficult it was to understand. From her perspective, it was all smoke and mirrors. But you guys as leaders will understand what you can do, what levers you can pull to actually start to have an influence on that. There's a fairly diverse group of people from diverse industries here. Whether it's public or private, I guess it's actually understanding what your role is and how you actually go about changing it. Because understanding what the policy objective is in the first place is important. But then, do you agree, disagree? What obstacles are in place to make a difference, to make it better, and then start to influence that. I suppose it's just all encompassing to, as a leader, you do have a choice and you can actually make a positive influence.
These folks will go home and a couple hundred emails all banked up, so I'd like you to genuinely show your appreciation and taking time out. Thank you.